The Xenoblade Chronicles series is responsible for opening my eyes to video games as bona fide works of art. These experiences, although often rough around the edges, legitimately have some of the most thought-provoking plots, characters, and themes of any game I've ever played. Each entry in the series holds a consistent beauty and brings to light new revelations and stories, building upon an ever-expansive multiverse of mystery and intrigue. With the recent release of Xenoblade Chronicles 3, I've been experiencing a renewed interest in what has to be my favorite ongoing series in gaming, and as Xenoblade 3 continues to keep me hooked for the reasons I just detailed, it's had me thinking back to another, lesser understood entry in the series, one for which not nearly as much clarity exists as the main three games. No, this title is definitely one which remains largely, if not entirely, unexplained throughout its whole plot, and which never seems to be mentioned or alluded to again in other Xenoblade works. I'm of course referring to 2015's Xenoblade Chronicles X, released just over halfway through the lifespan of the Wii U. In retrospect, it's not difficult to see why this game underperformed when it first came out, being such a pivot from its source material, Xenoblade Chronicles, which was the only other game in the would-be series at this point. And on top of the changes, with Xenoblade X releasing for a doomed console, let's just say that there was a lot stacked against this game. I didn't actually pick up Xenoblade X myself until the 2020 pandemic, when I was looking to catch up on a number of games given the unexpected free time. This was well after the release of Xenoblade 2 in 2018, and as such, playing Xenoblade X really got me thinking, what in the world was Monolith trying to convey with this release? It's very clear that Xenoblade 2 and 3 are intended as deliberate extensions of the story first set in motion by the original, but this game is something completely different. I don't think that's hard to see even just looking at the box art. In particular, the question that I've had ever since playing Xenoblade X is this: is it canon? And if so, how? So today, I'm going to break out my lore analysis helmet and we're going to dive together into the enigmatic and futuristic world of this Wii U exclusive entry in a cult classic JRPG series, all in hopes of answering the question that's been on my mind in some capacity for multiple years now. Strap in for this one because what I've found may surprise you. By the end of my research into this topic, I'd actually felt like I'd arrived at a definitive answer to this question, but when I first began that research, I almost immediately felt lost, and so it was a long process to arrive at this video's dramatic conclusion. I'll be guiding you through the same train of thought I utilized to reach that conclusion, because even though much of what I had first thought ended up producing false leads, this is definitely a topic where the devil is very much in the details, and the contextual findings are what tie everything together in the end. So, with that in mind, why don't we start down the rabbit hole? There are really two common theories in regard to connecting Xenoblade X with the rest of the series. Both are story-related approaches to this question, and both are usually passed around in jest, a testament to the very little similarity between titles, but nevertheless, this is the vantage from which I began an investigation into this topic. First, there's a theory that Moratha from Xenoblade 2 might be New Los Angeles from Xenoblade X, the city which acts as the main hub of the game. This doesn't make a lot of sense, however, given what we know about the world of Allrest and how it was created in the first place. I won't go into detail in case there's anyone out there watching who hasn't yet played Xenoblade 2, but I imagine many of you are at least passingly familiar with what goes down. Aside from this, I did consider, although very briefly, the somewhat laughable possibility that the X in Xenoblade X is supposed to represent the number 10 in Roman numerals, making this the 10th installment in the series, and we've just been waiting for the other games to catch up. This was a bit of a meme within the Xenoblade community after the release of Xenoblade 2, and obviously it's just meant for fun. The reason I even decided to seriously consider this at all will be revealed as the video goes on, but nevertheless, after I very quickly exhausted these two options for any serious consideration, I wasn't left with a whole lot else to speculate on. At this point, it seemed the quote-unquote plausible vectors for canonicity had run dry rather quickly. There's just not a lot here that seems to suggest any justifiable connections to any of the mainline Xenoblade titles. However, these are not the only Xeno games out there, as any good Xeno fan would be quick to point out. There are actually at least 4 other titles that fall under the umbrella of the Xeno meta-series, including 1998's Xenogears for PS1 and the Xenosaga trilogy released by Monolith Soft between the year 2002 and 2006 on the PlayStation 2. These titles, even from a surface-level glance, have much more in common with X than any of the other Xenoblade games, and so I began to form a new hypothesis. A hypothesis which has everything to do with Monolith as a company. If you already know about the history of how Xenogears and Xenosaga came to be, then feel free to skip ahead to this point in the video, but if not, here's a rather brief overview of what occurred. Now, I've set out to record this part of the video a couple of times at this point, and every time I can't help but feel like I'm over-explaining the history of Monolith Soft and the Xeno series. At some point in the future, I'll probably make a video about just this dedicated topic, but for now, here's the super Cliff Notes version of the history that you'll need in order to understand my theory and thinking moving forward. Back in the 90s, 2 employees at Squaresoft, now known as Square Enix, by the names of Tetsuya Takahashi and Kaori Tanaka had a vision. Both individuals had worked on high-profile games such as Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, and were very familiar with game development and story writing, especially with regard to JRPGs. As a matter of fact, the two had met one another working at Square and had married sometime previous to when this story takes place. As Square was gearing up on development for Final Fantasy VII, the 3D successor to their well-beloved Final Fantasy VI, the team obviously didn't want to waste any opportunity to propel Final Fantasy to new heights, and so not only did they intend to make the graphical capabilities of the game impressive, they wanted to create a story for Final Fantasy VII which would captivate audiences and be difficult to forget. To this end, the team at Square overheard many proposals for just what that story should be, and one such proposal came from Mr. Takahashi and Mrs. Tanaka. They outlined an impressively thought-out and complex world, with numerous religious undertones and themes of Gnosticism, the likes of which Final Fantasy hadn't really explored in the past. It seems that the higher-ups at Square took a liking to this idea, but ultimately concluded it was too dark for Final Fantasy, and so the team ultimately went in another direction, creating the Final Fantasy VII that we all know and love today. However, Mr. Takahashi and Ms. Tanaka's proposal was allowed to be released as its own standalone project, not connected in any way to Final Fantasy's universe or characters. This game would become known as Xenogears, and would release 1 year after Final Fantasy VII for the PS1. The game was considered a commercial success, selling over 800,000 units in its first year, but Square likely saw the success of their bigger project a year prior, which had sold nearly double of what Xenogears had done in its first year, within the first 24 hours of release, and decided that the Xenogears series, which Tanaka and Takahashi had planned out, would likely not be allowed to continue in favor of producing more Final Fantasy. This was understandably discouraging to the couple who had created Xenogears, and so 1 year later they left the company and formed Monolith Software Incorporated along with 2 other ex-Square employees. Together, and in partnership with Namco, the new studio created the Xenosaga series, a spiritual successor to Gears, in hopes of telling their full story, of which Xenogears was only one part of an intended 6. In 2007, however, Monolith Soft would accept an offer to be purchased by Nintendo, and this would set the team back once again. Whether for licensing or for want of trying something new after the mixed reception of Xenosaga, the team pivoted once again and created Xenoblade Chronicles. This is the form which the Xeno series story continues to take in the modern day, as we all know. But while Xenosaga was very clearly inspired by Xenogears, Xenoblade Chronicles is often considered quite different in its atmosphere and setting. As such, it's still highly debated if Xenogears, Xenosaga, and Xenoblade Chronicles are canonically connected in any way. That more or less wraps up the history of the Xeno series, and if you skipped ahead to this point, welcome back. You may now have some idea of why I more closely looked into the possibility of Xenoblade X secretly being Xenoblade X. Considering Takahashi and Tanaka had planned out a 6-part episodic series at Square, only to release part 5 of that narrative in the form of Xenogears and nothing else, I considered there to be a slim possibility that Xenoblade may have also been devised in such a format, telling the story forwards and backwards simultaneously. Luckily, Xenoblade Chronicles has proceeded in order thus far. Now we get into the reason that I felt it necessary to tell you all of that in the first place, the theory which I alluded to earlier. And while, in light of other evidence, I don't think that this theory is quite on the nose, it is a substantially better guess than anything else we've posited so far in this video. I'll address the aspects of this theory which I believe falsify it as we continue, but for now, let me just tell you what the theory was. It goes like this. Xenoblade Chronicles X may be a spiritual retelling of Xenogears or Xenosaga. Consider that Mr. Takahashi and Mrs. Tanaka, as well as the rest of the Monolith team, have been dead set on telling a version of that original story for more than 20 years at this point. I believe that even now, they continue the Xeno naming convention and story structure laid out in their original plan as devised for Xenogears, but licensing has consistently set the team back and forced them to become a bit tricky in regards to how that story can actually be told nowadays. Square Enix, of course, still owns the rights to Xenogears, even though the game was dreamt up by these two storytellers. So, let's momentarily entertain the thought that Monolith wanted to re-release Xenogears for one reason or another. There are two ways that they could go about this. First, they could try and convince Papa Nintendo to invest presumably millions of dollars to buy back the rights to the Xenogears IP, in hopes that sales of the remake would compensate for the difference. And that's assuming that Square was looking to sell such rights to a direct competitor who previously left their company specifically to make these games in the first place. Assuming that wasn't an obstacle, which, I'll remind you, it very much would be, there's also the issue of Nintendo's stringent anti-religion policy, which would make it impossible to discuss or reference many of the topics within Xenogears without the gratuitous employment of censorship and redesign which would fundamentally change the story. It's here where I'll divulge that a main driving force behind the events of Xenogears and Saga shares its name with a foundational part of Jewish literature, the Zohar, that the games refer to planet Earth as Lost Jerusalem, and that Jesus Christ is literally a character within Xenosaga, and presumed to be one within Gears as well. So religion is more than a little bit important to telling the story here. Considering a theoretical Xenogears remake of this nature would almost certainly be construed as a blasphemous mockery of the original, not only by fans, but by the very developers themselves, perhaps the answer is not to take this approach, and to simply hide the symbolism, and let the fans exercise the legwork necessary to uncover the rest. This is what I believed to be going on within Xenoblade X. After all, the warring alien species of the Ganglion and the Ghosts of X may allude to the two warring nations of Ava and Kislev in Xenogears. Perhaps Elma is a stand-in for Ellie Van Houten. Maybe the White Whale is a stand-in for the Eldridge. As I began to actually apply the theory, however, while there are a number of parallels, they weren't particularly damning. For example, the chances of two spacecraft crashing within two different science fiction series is decently common. Elma and Ellie have fairly different backgrounds, and the Ganglion versus Ghosts dynamic takes place in a completely different scenario to that of Eva and Kislev. They're fighting under not even remotely similar circumstances. In fact, I think that the whole warring nations setup from Xenogears may have actually served as the inspiration for a lot of the stuff in Xenoblade 3, but that's a rabbit hole to dive down at a later date. We're not going to get into that now. Anyway, the point of Xenoblade X being a remake of Gears doesn't hold a lot of water. While there are certainly some parallels and nods to Xenogears, Xenoblade X is ultimately a completely different story. They're just two games, both with big robots, and there doesn't really seem to be anything that suggests a retread of the original Xenosaga trilogy either. But that's not to say that there isn't still some connection. Allow me to quote from the page regarding humans on the Xenosaga fandom wiki. In AD 2XXX, humanity discovered an object called the Zohar, and its Xenogears variant. In the Xenosaga continuity, humanity had no choice but to escape the planet via spaceships after a Zohar link experiment was performed and a space-time anomaly was produced. In the Xenogears continuity, there is no mention of this space-time anomaly, and the timeline simply mentions humanity left Earth. In both series, Earth was renamed Lost Jerusalem and became inaccessible, and humanity explored and colonized space under the duress of the Galaxy Federation. As it turns out, Lost Jerusalem, which I mentioned in passing earlier, seems to be the linchpin in this whole mess of continuity which we found ourselves in. The fact of the matter is this. While none of Xenoblade X's content points to a remake of any previous games, there's still a very deliberate reason that the story is the way it is, and that it's so different from mainline Xenoblade. And now, ladies, gentlemen, esteemed viewers, one and all, I present to you what I believe to be the true answer as to Xenoblade X's canonicity within the series. Xenoblade Chronicles X is probably canon to Xenoblade Chronicles and its sequels, but only indirectly. It is, however, definitely canon to Xenogears and Xenosaga. What Xenoblade X actually tells us is the story of why Earth was abandoned and became Lost Jerusalem. As mentioned before, the specifics of why humanity lost the location of Earth are left unsaid in Xenogears, but we finally get these answers within Xenoblade X. It might first seem strange how humanity could forget the location of Earth, but consider the opening sequence to the game. Earth was raised completely asunder by warring alien factions. Not only did people need to escape quickly, but they also presumed that their world was gone. It was thought that there was nothing to return to, and thus Jerusalem was lost. You could also interpret this in terms of Xenosaga, however, and when you do, the Mimosomes, a race of mechanically augmented people who are the only survivors of the crash of the white whale at the beginning of the game, begin to feel very, very similar to the Synths, a race of mechanically augmented people who live in equal standing to organic humans in Xenosaga. Not to mention this bit of speculation posted on GameFAQs 6 years ago by a user named Primus, which highlights how the lyrics to Xenoblade X's battle theme, Black Tar, seem to allude to some entity with the ability to, quote, possess people and turn them against one another. Not unlike the Gnosis of Xenosaga. If we look at what the Gnosis actually are, they're an alien race very similar to the one we see battling the Ganglion over Earth in the beginning cutscene. The Gnosis are the ghosts, and in fact, the reason that we even call them ghosts is also because of the lyrics of Black Tar. To tie all of this up though, let me remind you that, quote, in the Xenosaga continuity, humanity had no choice to escape the planet Earth via spaceships after a Zohar Link experiment was performed and a space-time anomaly was produced. I'll be damned if that doesn't sound mysteriously similar to a particular experiment involving Klaus and Mayneth that set into motion the entire story of Xenoblade Chronicles, Xenoblade 2, and Xenoblade 3. To recap, I think it's safe to say we now have enough evidence to make 3 key assertions. Xenosaga and Xenogears are undeniably connected through the events in Xenoblade Chronicles X. Xenoblade Chronicles X is meant to creatively fill in the gaps of Takahashi and Tanaka's Xeno series, alluding to the idea that they still, after nearly 20 years, have not given up on that original story they outlined and pitched to Squaresoft. If that's not commitment, I'm not really sure what is. Third and finally, I believe that Xenoblade X stands a real chance of getting a sequel, at least one sequel, in fact. The White Whale wasn't the only arc to leave Earth unscathed, so I could see a story that follows real human characters on another planet, somehow meeting the Mimosomes from Mira, spreading influence throughout the universe, and forming the Galactic Federation from Xenosaga. That's really just one vector though, there's a whole realm of places where Monolith could take Xenoblade X as a sub-series. Xenoblade X games could help fill in the 5 missing episodes of Xenogears, finally finishing that original hexology, and much more. Recently, I've been concluding my videos with a joke or sketch of some kind, but I don't have anything like that prepared today. Instead, I wanted to leave you with this. I believe that Mr. Takahashi and Mrs. Tanaka have faced some of the most extreme roadblocks to storytelling that any artist could probably ever hope to come across. That being said, necessity is the mother of invention, and the team at Monolith exemplifies this, as well as the spirit of perseverance in the face of difficulty. Perhaps this is why they can write about such themes in their games without coming across as being insincere. I think that every game in the Xeno series, including Xenoblade Chronicles X, is the product of a very real desire to create and tell a story which reflects real-world morality, values, and lessons, especially with regard to camaraderie, brotherhood, love, and perseverance in the face of fate. It's interesting when we consider that it is perhaps a culmination of these factors which has led to the Xeno series existing in the first place. Obviously, the Xeno series means quite a lot to me in this regard, but moreover than that, it's just plain fun. I plan to do a lot more related to the Xeno series on this channel, so if that sounds interesting to you, maybe consider sticking around. It's not going to be the only thing I cover, of course, but there will certainly be a plethora of Xeno uploads sprinkled in with the other stuff I'm planning. If you want to talk further about Xeno series lore, video games, or pretty much anything else to do with media, feel free to join my channel's associated Discord server. It's linked in the description. I've also got a second channel, formerly Everberon Live. I'm going to be using that channel more and more in the coming weeks and months. There will be a couple videos coming out about what's going to be happening over on that channel very soon. That's going to do it for today though, folks. This is Everberon, and I'll see you again in a future upload. Until then though, have a good one.